Sarah, come here, Caleb said with a weight in his voice that I wasn't accustomed to. The sound of the door closing resounded behind me, and my heart raced. His tone wasn't harsh, but it had an undeniable charge that made the atmosphere between us electric. Seated on the living room couch, his posture relaxed, but his eyes, those eyes, held an intensity I'd never seen before. This wasn't the Caleb I knew, the one who had always appeared so steady and predictable. In that moment, he was anything but. Something about Caleb's presence now made the room feel smaller and the air heavier. But before I tell you how everything shifted, let me take you back to where it all began. In order to understand what happened, you need to know what happened in the past. His words lingered in the air like a challenge, and my mind raced to figure out how we got here. Just days ago, this would have been unthinkable. It all started the first night my mom was gone for work. It wasn't unusual for her to travel for work all the time, leaving Caleb and me alone in the house. Usually, Caleb would keep to himself, tinkering in the garage or watching TV in the evenings. I liked the space and quiet, but this time something was different. I returned from school to find Caleb in the kitchen, wearing an apron, chopping. He rarely cooked, but he was there, looking very serious. "Hey, Sarah," he greeted me with a smile and said, "Hey, I thought I'd give cooking a try for dinner tonight. I hope you don't mind if I do." I responded with a hint of surprise, not really thinking much about it until we sat down to eat. As we ate, he said, "You seem really focused lately. I take it that school is keeping you busy." I nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious under his scrutiny. "I have a lot of projects going on right now," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Chair, please know that you are never alone and that I am here to help in any way I can." His words were kind, but they irritated me. He stared directly into my eyes the whole time, and I muttered a quick thank you before quietly going to my room. The following day, I felt like Caleb was spending more time than usual with me. When I walked downstairs to get my coffee, he was already there. Usually he'd be in the garage or watching the news, but today he greeted me with a warm smile and said, "Good morning, Sarah. Sleep well." I grabbed a piece of toast and tried not to notice how closely he was watching me. He then said, "You've been looking really grown up lately. It suits you." My cheeks burned, and I didn't know what to say, so I mumbled thanks and rushed out the door. But by the third day, his behavior had changed, and I couldn't help but notice. That night, I was sitting on the couch. He entered the room while I was scrolling through my phone, sat down on the other end of the couch, and turned on the TV. At first, he said nothing, but then he asked, "Are we not going out tonight?" I looked at him confused, and he replied, "It's nice to have you around, but the house feels too quiet when it's just me." His words lingered in the air, and I didn't know what to say. He wasn't doing anything obviously wrong, but there was a tone in his voice, a weight to his words that made my stomach twist, so I pretended to concentrate on my thoughts. I couldn't help but feel his gaze fixed on me that night. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was amiss. Caleb wasn't acting like himself, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Was I overanalyzing his behavior, or was there something more serious going on? As I lay in bed, I recalled his past looks at me, and his compliments seemed different, not fatherly, but more like a stepdad should look at his stepdaughter. What's worse, a tiny, horrible part of me couldn't. It wasn't unusual for the man to leave for another business trip, leaving Caleb and me at home alone. Her work often kept her away, and Caleb and I had settled into a quiet routine. He was always polite and supportive, but I hated the attention and felt guilty about it. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of what was to come. Listen closely because the story is about to get even more intense. When Caleb entered the room, he casually held a bowl of popcorn and said, "Hey Sarah, you like dramas, right?" I was sitting on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, and he sat down next to me, a little closer than usual. He turned on the TV, and at first, I didn't think much of it. We weren't particularly close, but this didn't seem out of the ordinary. Then, about 15 minutes into the movie, his arm brushed against mine, interrupting our quiet conversation. I glanced over at him and saw a smile that seemed to mix amusement and regret. He leaned back into the couch and said, Sorry about that. I nodded and tried to brush it off, but the image of his smile stuck with me long after the movie ended. The following day, I came downstairs to find Caleb in the kitchen, chopping vegetables like an expert. I was surprised, but I thought I'd give it a go. I felt caught off guard when he looked at me for an unusually long time, smiling at the corner of his mouth. Later, as we sat at the table eating, he continued the conversation by inquiring about my school, friends, and weekend plans. His questions weren't inappropriate, but he seemed more focused than usual. "You've grown up so much," he said suddenly, his tone casual but his words stunning me. I felt my cheeks flush as I mumbled a thank you, but the compliment was too personal and two-faced. I ate my dinner fast and left, but his words lingered in my head all night. The next day, Caleb was constantly popping up. Whenever I went to the kitchen, he'd ask if I needed a drink of water. It was subtle, but I did notice that he offered to help me with lunch that afternoon. I was nervous, but I figured it was for the best. As I was getting everything ready, he stood too near, his arm brushing mine once more. This time, he didn't back down. "You look really nice today," he said in a low, deliberate voice. "Thanks," I replied, trying to avoid his stare. My hands trembled slightly as I chopped vegetables, but I pretended not to notice his intense scrutiny. I didn't dare admit it. When I was through, he reached out to take the knife from me, his hand grazing mine. "I'll take care of." "Do you mind if I sit for a bit?" he asked, gesturing toward the bed. "Sure," I whispered back, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, not too close, but his expression was calm and purposeful. By the third day, I couldn't ignore his behavior. It was impossible to ignore. His words lingered in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning as I felt his eyes on me. For a moment, our gazes met, and I thought I caught a glimpse of something in his expression. He chuckled softly, complimenting Sarah, saying, "You remind me a lot of myself when I was your age, independent, focused, and strong." I blinked, unsure of what to say, and I mumbled something while looking away. There was an unspoken statement that made my heart race. I stood up and quickly said, "I have homework." His voice was calm but unreadable as he stood. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You know, you can always talk to me, right? Yeah." I avoided looking at him and sat back down, my heart pounding. The atmosphere between us felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Caleb wasn't doing anything overt, but his actions were deliberate enough to make me question his motives. I lay in bed that night replaying every interaction in my mind. His lingering hand, his eyes on me for too long, the weight of his words, it all felt real. What was worse was that a shameful part of me didn't hate the attention, but I couldn't shake the thought. It gnawed at the edges of my mind, making me wonder what would happen next. By the third day, I could feel something deliberate happening, and everything felt planned. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts as I sat in my room trying to focus on a book. My stomach tightened instinctively, but I kept my voice steady. Caleb stepped in, his expression calm but purposeful. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on my desk and the half-empty mug of tea I'd left there. It was as if he was trying to create moments that didn't need to exist, but felt impossible to ignore. "He wanted to see how you were doing. He mentioned that you seemed distant earlier." I said, "I'm fine," putting the book down. He nodded, but instead of leaving, he stepped further into the room. "You know," he started to speak quietly, saying things like, "It's okay to take a break sometimes we push ourselves too hard." I remained silent. The room felt cramped with his presence. He sat on the edge of my bed, his weight slightly causing the mattress to sink. He went on to reflect on how I used to feel when I was younger, saying things like, "Just keep going." I looked at him, unsure of what to say. His words seemed harmless at first, but his expression suggested there was more he wasn't saying. "Sarah," he whispered, breaking the silence. "You don't have to carry everything alone. You can talk to me about anything." "Thanks." I mumbled something about feeling uneasy, but I assured him it was all right. He smiled faintly, leaning forward slightly, and said, "You're stronger and smarter than most people your age. It's impressive." Thanks." I continued as he expressed his gratitude. His words warmed my cheeks, and though I waited for him to say something, he leaned casually against the counter, saying, "Good morning," in a light voice, and just as I thought he might leave, he reached out and touched my shoulder. It wasn't inappropriate, exactly, but the warmth of his touch lingered long after I stood up and walked out the door. The following day, I couldn't shake his presence. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake it. I was about to turn to leave the kitchen when he interrupted. "You've got a busy day ahead, just like usual. Take it easy and remember to take care of yourself." His words were harmless and kind, but the way he said them made me prickle. It felt like he was trying to say something else, something I wasn't prepared to hear. That afternoon, I was in the living room, half watching TV and half scrolling through social media. I was scrolling through my phone when Caleb entered the room. He sat down on the couch, not exactly next to me, but close enough that I could feel the change in atmosphere. "What are you watching?" he asked, his eyes darting to the screen. "Just some random show." I responded without looking up. He chuckled softly, as if to say, "You've got good taste." I shrugged, trying to seem unconcerned, but I froze as his arm briefly touched mine. It was just a fleeting touch, but it set my heart racing. "You're quiet today," he said after a moment. "Is everything all right?" I responded. I stayed in my room that night in an attempt to avoid him, but as the hours passed, the tension in the house seemed to grow, pressing against the walls like it was alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb was waiting for something, and I felt my tone was sharper than I had intended when I said, "I'm fine." He raised his hands in a mock surrender, but I could tell he was waiting for something. In the dimly lit kitchen, there he stood. He spoke in a low, smooth voice, "Can't sleep." I avoided looking at him and replied, "Just thirsty." He moved aside to let me pass, but as I reached for a glass, he spoke again. "You've been on my mind a lot lately, Sarah." I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I simply care about you more than I probably should." The room was filled with anticipation. I turned to face him, my heart racing, and Caleb saying, "I shouldn't have said that, forget what I said," but I couldn't. His words lingered in the air, impossible to ignore that night as I lay in bed thinking about his confession, not just the words, but the way he said them and the expression on his face. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him and demand an explanation, but another part said I didn't want to. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Caleb's presence in the house felt larger, almost suffocating, but not in a way that made me want to escape. It was confusing and disorienting, like standing on the edge of a precipice. I hated myself for even considering it, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Caleb had crossed a line, and there was no going back. His words stayed with me long after the house fell silent. "I cared about you more than is probably healthy." That evening, after my shower, I opened the door to the bathroom. To my surprise, he was standing in the hallway. His eyes darted over me for a second before he pretended to look away, as if he hadn't noticed I was in there. He said, "It's fine," in a voice that betrayed his stiff posture. I muttered under my breath, clutching the towel closer to me. I hurriedly closed the door behind me, my heart racing with embarrassment, fear, or something else entirely. The expression on his face gave it away. As I refilled his water glass, Caleb said, "You've got such a graceful way about you." His tone was casual, but the way he watched me sent a shiver down my spine. I forced a laugh, brushing off the comment. "Thanks, I guess." But his eyes never left mine. "It's a good thing," he said softly, "because not everyone carries." I loaded the dishwasher with trepidation, trying to dispel the intense stare from Caleb. I despised how cognizant I was of his proximity and how his presence seemed to permeate the entire room. That night, the house was unusually silent. My mom was away, and her absence only served to heighten the tension between Caleb and me. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified. I made an effort to. I tried to divert my attention with a book, but the words became jumbled and unintelligible as I relived the events of the previous few days. His lingering compliments, his shadowy appearance everywhere I went, and the way his eyes followed me like a shadow made me wonder if I was hallucinating or if I was overanalyzing things. Then I recalled the hallway and the brief moment he looked at me, and I realized it wasn't my imagination. Suddenly, a gentle knock on my door interrupted my train of thought. Sarah's voice was. I gripped the edge of my blanket tightly, unsure of what to say. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside with an expression that betrayed his unreadable emotions. He held 2 mugs of tea, and he offered me one. I accepted, my fingers brushing against his. I quickly withdrew them, fixating on the mug as if it contained the answers to all my questions. He sat down on the chair beside the desk, leaving a deliberate space between us for a moment. The air seemed to escape the room as he sipped his tea, his voice low and sincere. I glanced at him, taken aback by his candor. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable, I lied. He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and continued, I care about you, Sarah, more than you probably realize. I set the mug down on my nightstand, my hands quivering slightly, and I couldn't find the words to express how much I meant what he said. He persisted. His tone was earnest, and he said things like, You're special. You've always been special. I felt my heart race as I swallowed, and I stood up, trying to put some space between us because I didn't feel comfortable answering his question. He remained motionless, but his eyes followed me. What if it is? The question hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. I stayed in my room as much as I could the next morning, acting like I was busy with schoolwork, but by lunchtime, I was feeling overwhelmed by his words. I was dragged downstairs by my nausea, but I found him in the kitchen, propped up against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. Good morning, he said in a low voice that matched the intensity in his eyes. I responded distantly, grew a piece of fruit, and was about to leave when his voice stopped me. Sarah, I froze, and he spoke softly, I hope I didn't upset you last night. I slowly turned around, meeting his gaze. It was fine. A faint smile escaped his eyes. Good. I just wanted you to know that you can. I nodded, unsure of how to respond, and then I left the room, my heart racing again. By nightfall, the tension in the house had become intolerable. I felt my chest tighten with each step he took into any room, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was building, something inevitable. That night, he knocked on my door, and I nearly didn't answer, but the sound of the handle turning suggested that it didn't matter. He was coming in anyhow. He spoke in a low voice, so I chose to observe instead of responding. As he pushed the door shut behind him, he slumped against the wall, his posture relaxed, but his gaze intense. Are you okay? He asked, his tone sincere. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He drew nearer, and I remained motionless. I don't want you to feel alone, Sarah. I'm here always. It was at that moment that I realized the line between us had already blurred, no matter how much I attempted to avoid it. Whatever happened next was bound to be inevitable. The tension between us had reached its peak, and I knew there was no turning back. As he inched closer, his hand resting delicately on my face, the world around us seemed to freeze in place. The sounds of the house melted away, leaving us in an eerie stillness. His intense stare fixed on mine, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. My heart raced, not with fear, but with the palpable tension that hung between us, as if we were on the brink of something irreversible. His touch was careful, almost hesitant, but it sent shivers down my spine. I whispered, my voice barely audible, as if I weren't. He hesitated, his expression unreadable, before softly closing the door behind him. The room shrank and the air became heavier as he inched closer, his movements controlled yet deliberate. He was pushing the limits of what was permissible, and my mind was in a whirlwind of chaos, but my body was frozen in place. Our eyes met in a silent conversation, and we couldn't bring ourselves to speak out. Then, his hand brushed against mine, and it lingered for an extra second, sending a jolt of. I felt a shiver run down my spine as he spoke softly, his voice steady, but with an unspoken depth and honesty that rendered me speechless. What followed was an irreversible event. The silence was deafening, as if the outside world had vanished. Finally, with the ordeal over, I lay on the couch, my mind racing and my heart racing. That night changed everything. CB and I crossed a line we could never undo. As I lay there, the weight of what had happened pressed down on me, but I also felt a strange sense of relief, as if nothing could go back. There was no turning back, and while I don't regret it, nothing will ever be the same. What would you have done in my situation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.